Good afternoon. On behalf of the University of California in San Francisco, Stanford University, and the University of California at Berkeley, I'd like to welcome you to the Breakthrough Prize panel discussion, which tonight will feature a number of distinguished scientists and researchers, all of them winners of the Breakthrough Prize. Some of them just received their awards last night at a fabulous gala hosted by the founders of the Breakthrough Prizes, and I was fortunate to be able to attend and to be part of an evening that gave the same kind of recognition to scientists, mathematicians, and researchers that is normally reserved for entertainers. And indeed, there were many entertainers there who paid tribute both to the prize and the recipients and the larger cause. I would like to thank the Breakthrough Prize Foundation, and especially Yuri Milner, who is the visionary behind it, for their extraordinary commitment to science, for their vision to establish the Breakthrough Prize Foundation and the many initiatives associated with it. In addition to the support and vision that Yuri Milner himself has brought to this, I'd also like to mention the family foundations of Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, and Jack Ma, all who also support this prize and foundation. In addition to the prizes, the foundation supports a number of other initiatives, including Breakthrough Listen, a $100 million effort to help launch a comprehensive search for artificial radio and optical signals in the universe, Breakthrough Message, a $1 million competition to design a message representing Earth and humanity that could potentially be understood by another civilization. And in partnership with the Khan Academy, the Breakthrough Prize Foundation also recently announced the Breakthrough Junior Challenge for high school students, which we witnessed last night in the awarding of a prize, which is a global competition among high school students to explain a challenging and important concept or theory in mathematics, to award a prize to a winner and give support for college tuition and also science instruction in their high school at the level of $400,000. Last night, we not only heard the extraordinary enthusiasm and talent of the young man who received the award, but also his tribute to his teacher, his physics teacher. And we all acknowledge at some level that the education that leads to great science begins long before students come to college. That being said, we're here to celebrate the importance of science education and research in our three universities. And we are just so grateful for the recognition and support this prize and this foundation shows to our core mission. So last night we celebrated the Breakthrough Prize laureates and their accomplishments. And during this panel this evening, we will hear from many of them about their research and about the implications their research has on the very big questions that touch all of our lives. So thank you too to Yuri, not just for the vision to create this and the support to make it possible, but also for your personal attention. I know from a story you told me when we first met how deeply you believe in the cause of science and in giving this kind of recognition support to it. I also know that you studied physics and loved the opportunity to go back and talk about your first love with some of these brilliant researchers. So I also know you today moderated the panels, and it's your energy and drive that has helped not only make this prize and this foundation so important, but also help bring this distinguished group of researchers together, and also our three host universities together this evening. So please join me in welcoming Yuri Milner.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dirks, thank you for the introduction, and Berkeley for creating this amazing platform for today's discussions. So for this part of the today's event, we were thinking together with Berkeley what we should talk about, and we decided not to mess up with a small things and go straight into 3 questions. What is the origin of life? Why is the universe comprehensible? And how does the human brain work? So, and we are supposed to cover all that in an hour and a half. So I decided to optimize the introduction of the panelists, and instead of going through credentials, I would just name them, and you should all assume that they're all Breakthrough Prize laureates at different years. And this is the unifying principle here. So I would then start with the first panel, which is what is the origins of life? And I will invite Jennifer Doudna, Svante Pääbo, and Gary Ruvkun, and Bob Weinberg on stage. Well, so Gary, how did it all begin?
The dominant theory that most biologists subscribe to of the first sort of observable life is the RNA world, which was an RNA-based world that you can still see evidence for in our modern genomes. And these are like living fossils that live in our ribosome. They live in self-splicing RNAs that are still with us. And you can see evidence for it in the nucleotide cofactors that are used in modern metabolism. But it's quite opaque what's before the RNA world. People try to study it by sort of synthesizing new worlds as we imagine they might be. But it's not quite like doing biology where you're sort of seeing that RNA world, and one would hope to be able to find it, for example, still alive in certain ecosystems. It was displaced by the DNA world, sometime in the last 3 billion years. The fossil evidence is for sort of bacteria-like life, that you can see the morphology of bacteria in fossils 3.5 billion years old. And so those look like DNA world organisms.
Jennifer, what do you think?
So I think one of the questions is whether life required some kind of encapsulation of molecules to allow evolution to occur. Or some people argue that maybe clays or rocks or some other kind of substrate allowed that kind of sequestration. And I don't know if there's a real consensus about that right now. When I was a graduate student, my advisor, Jack Shostak, was very interested in this question of the origin of life and the molecules that were responsible for creating a self-replicating system. And we used to debate this question in the laboratory. We never really came to an answer, but...
They're very much working on it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the universals of microbial life, what they have in common is this ability to pump protons. They are essentially little batteries. And all these organisms have reductants and oxidants, not necessarily oxygen. And they live on gradients of that. And their ability to pump protons and charge up a membrane and then run that in reverse to make ATP is the key unifying feature of metabolism across the microbial world. And the guess would be that the RNA world did something similar to that. It was still using ATP as a currency of energy, most likely. And so the RNA world then would have had to have membranes as a way to charge something up and form a polarization like that, and then use that energy for making ATP and other.
But if I can just add to that, so I think fundamentally, when I was first started thinking about this in graduate school, we talked about the definition of life. What's the definition of life, right? And really, I think it comes down to self-replication. I would argue. You have to have some way of making copies and having encoded information, and you can envision maybe different ways of doing that. But fundamentally, it really comes down to a system that is able to do that, and maybe you require energy to do it, but but fundamentally you have to be able to make copies of something.
And
right?
synthetic biologists have made replicases, right? From
Right.
the fossilized RNA metabolism enzymes that exist in modern genomes. Replicases have been evolved, but they haven't. An RNA replicase of an RNA organism has not been found yet.
No, that's right.
And
But we don't even know, we don't really know how many different life forms were initially evolved. All we know is who won out. What we have is we're the results of the winners and the arbitrary choices that were made evolutionarily on how we, the winners, would be put together. DNA would be a right or a left-handed helix, D or L amino acids, a whole myriad of other kinds of arbitrary decisions that once they were made, we were stuck with for the next 3 billion years or so, because they were immutable. Once we tried to tinker with them, whoever tried to tinker with them, or whatever, would create chaos and biological inviability. So we're the inheritors of a whole series of ultimately rather arbitrary decisions that somehow worked and were better than all the other arbitrary decisions that ended up being outcompeted and disappearing from the planet.
So if you ran the whole experiment again, would we be sitting here?
Impossible to know.
Jennifer, do you think there's any conceivable alternative to RNA, DNA world? Do people think about it, and do we have any idea of any possible alternative?
Well, I think the challenge with the RNA, DNA world, so I guess the RNA world hypothesis is how did you get the starting materials for that world? And I think it's a fundamental mystery, and many very brilliant people have worked on this, and you can create some of the starting materials from very simple chemical starting points, but how nature did it is unclear. And you may know that Francis Crick hypothesized that maybe some of the biological molecules came from elsewhere in the universe and arrived on our planet. And it's really
I'm a
it's really not
huge
clear.
fan of that.
Sci-fi.
Bob, let's assume that we arrived at a single cell. Then, of course, the next big transition is multicellular organism. So how did that happen?
Well, we know that we had nucleated cells probably were invented about 1.5 billion years ago, and roughly for the next 900 million years or so, eukaryotic cells with nuclei evolved more and more. The big thing that was missing was how could different cells talk to one another? Because in order to create a complex multicellular organism, you need to have cell-to-cell communication. Otherwise there can't be any coordination between the actions of the individual cells. And the invention of that cell-to-cell communication probably happened roughly 650 million years ago. There's a lady here at Berkeley, I believe her name is Nicole King, who studies that the early antecedents of multicellular organisms in sponge-like or coral-like organisms, and they were already probably around 600 million years ago, and they already had a lot of the genes that we find in our own DNA. So many of the tools, the hardware that are required in aggregate to enable intercellular communication was probably invented around then. Around 550 million years ago was the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And in rapid order then, once the solution to how to make a multicellular organism was put together, was cobbled together, literally, then all the diverse multicellular animal life forms on the planet could develop, and they did so explosively.
And what exactly was already in place 500 million years ago versus what was changing fundamentally?
Since then, you mean?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that most of the proteins were already in place back then, and then it was just a matter of running a lot of experiments.
Evolution has been pretty boring for the last 500 million years, because all of the requisite proteins it really takes to make a complex multicellular organism had been invented by then. And the rest of animal evolution over the last 500 million years is just shuffling them around and turning them on and off at different times during complex multicellular development. Mammalian evolution is totally boring, because once mammalian proteins had been invented, let's say 150 million years ago, then you could make all the mammals that exist here on the planet, not by inventing new proteins, but simply by turning genes on and off at different times in development and to different extents.
It did generate puppies.
I'm left speechless.
Very good.
So Gary,
Not insignificant.
what does life on this planet tells you about possible existence on other planets, and can you elaborate on that?
It tells you probably nothing with assurance, right? You have a statistics of 1, it's here. And the question is, when you try to look elsewhere, should you look without being biased by what you know about life here?
So let's start with the solar system first.
Right. So most plans to look for life on Mars, for example, don't try to look for life on Mars that would be like life on Earth, because that's too anthropocentric. It's like thinking of life here as the center of the universe. But I personally think that that's sort of a dumb ideology, because why not think that it would be the closest thing to us? And so look using the tools that we have developed with our sort of trillion-dollar industry in genomics to actually look for life that's very much like life on Earth, because it's much easier to look for that. Now, it could be wrong. You might not find that, but it's just so much more powerful to do that. So,
But you're assuming that there was significant exchange of material between all planets in the solar system.
And there is very significant interchange. There's a period of the late heavy bombardment, which is when Earth was being bombarded with asteroid material, and sterilizing collisions were taking place 100 to 1,000 times more than today, and that would spew out rocks to escape velocity. In many cases, they can actually be spewed out without heating. There's local heating where the collision takes place, but there are a certain amount of the impact actually gets sent to escape velocity without heating, and that would allow organisms to exchange between planets. And then people tend to think, oh, what about re-entry? How could you possibly re-enter? But that takes place in 2 seconds. So yes, the crust of a meteorite is red hot, and that's what you see. But inside, it's at black body temperature, 80 degrees Kelvin at the surface of the Earth. So that you could easily exchange between that. The other thing to keep in mind is that, to me, the most interesting thing about the discovery of exoplanets is the hot Jupiters, and these are the large planets that are at very small orbits that go around very quickly, and they couldn't have formed where they are. There's not enough mass to have formed there. So these are migrating planets. And so they must have been sending out rogue planets left and right, and these rogue planets are a way to send planet-sized rocks between solar systems. So then the issue is, well, how often do these get captured to equilibrate? So my own bias is that the RNA world didn't even take place on Earth, that the RNA world was somewhere else. It buys you about 10 billion years of time, but it really is a kind of a coward's way out, because it just says, well, it happened somewhere else. But I do think, but I am a coward, and I think, looking for DNA is in my view, the right approach to try first.
Yeah, but you're assuming that not only rocks get ejected, then the whole planet should be ejected from the solar system to make
right,
it
but
happen.
that gives you a vector for exchanging life with more local collisions.
And you're assuming by the time the bombardment happened, the life could have been already here, if it started here.
Well, there's a problem even looking at life on Earth now, is from the fossil record. From the time of heavy bombardment to the time of fossils that look like bacteria, it's really short. So you either have to conclude that going from the primordial soup, the sort of the warm pond of chemicals, to a bacteria happens in a couple 100 million years, and it's just really dead easy, in which case every planet does it maybe all the same.
100 million years is a long time.
Yeah.
Not in your
14
life.
billion is longer. Or you can assume that something rained down and contaminated the planet. And Crick argued sort of in the view, hey, look, we're talking about terraforming, not we, some of the maniacs who think about colonizing other planets think, oh, well, first you have to terraform. You have to send bacteria to these planets and have them transform atmospheres. much the way our atmosphere was transformed by photosynthetic bacteria. The oxygen that we enjoy is a poison produced by bacteria. They poisoned our planet. Well, if we're going to be terraforming in 1,000 years, if the Mars colonists have their way, well, maybe there were other people who were terraforming before us. Maybe we were terraformed.
Bob, what can you say on that?
I can only smile politely. I think the notion of life beginning elsewhere, of course, just pushes the problem back to another locale, and it's most plausible, given everything we know, that life actually did originate on this planet, that we descend from organisms that first invented cellular life on this planet about 3 billion years ago. It's really pretty hard, given the conditions that are required to sustain viable cells, to imagine really that it came from elsewhere. Of course, one can conjure up all kinds of scenarios, which are wonderful stories, but I can only smile politely.
One suggestion in terms of when I was hearing about sending out signals to other planets, to intelligent life, I would suggest sending the DNA sequence of a great white shark. So that if they try to infer who we are
They're
badass
really scared.
and stay away.
Well, we have an expert here, Svante, who really made a dramatic effort in sequencing Neanderthal genome, among others. And the appropriate question to ask would be, let's look at the last 100,000 years, which is, from our standpoint, the most interesting period of time, when somehow intelligence as we know it appeared. And relatively fast, I mean amazingly fast, just given all these billions and hundreds of millions of years. So how do you think it happened?
Yes, so it's sort of a bit sad to hear that the last 100 million years are sort of uninteresting, but
Sorry. Really sorry.
but so it's of course it's a question what we mean with intelligence then. I guess one sort of direction of insights over the last decades have been that many of the things we have traditionally associated only with humans and human intelligence have been found in other organisms. Tool use have been found not only in other primates, but also in birds and other things, cooperation, etc. But it's also true that these things come together in a totally unique and very powerful combination in hominins, and among the hominins, particularly in modern humans, that then appear only somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago. And up to that point, Neanderthals and all other forms of humans that have existed, yes, they used stone tools, yes, they used fire, but they sort of essentially behaved like other primates and mammals. They didn't change very much over hundreds of thousands of years. They didn't spread across open water, etc. And all that changes with modern humans. And in just 60, 70,000 years, we colonized the whole planet. And of course, to me, one of the most fascinating questions is, how did that come to happen? And I think it must have had a biological basis in some form. But what that is of course not at all clear today.
How much experimentation was going on in terms of how many human-like species existed sort of in the last million years?
Over the last million years, very many, I suppose. And at the time...
Is it hundreds of thousands or dozens?
Well, I'm not really an expert in saying that over a million years, but in the hundreds for sure. And then when modern humans came around, other forms that were around there were at least a handful, if not more, of forms that then all disappeared in the encounter with modern humans. And I think there are sort of rather good arguments that some of this have to do with forming bigger societies and communicating in big groups, so that you can accumulate knowledge and have this ratchet effect, where each generation learns what all the previous generations have acquired in terms of knowledge and builds on that. So it does have something to do with human cognition and communication, I think. And of course, the dream for me is to now use the Neanderthal genome that you have, our very closest extinct relative, compare that to the genomes of people who live today. We can now list the changes that we all have in common and that Neanderthals did not have. And the dirty little secret of genomics, so to say, is that we can stare at this list, which is around 30,000 changes, and we understand very little of what we see, because we're so very bad at interpreting what a particular change means in a phenotype. And that's really the challenge now, I think, to try to look through that.
But do we know at least something about this, or it's a complete
If
unknown?
I would guess, I would think it doesn't have to do, for example, with the size of your brain. Neanderthals had just as big brains, if not bigger brains than what we have. It must have something to do with how the brain works, and I would tend to guess it has to do with connectivity in the brain and with how brain's nerve cells interact with each other. So there is a set of 14 genes, for example, that have such changes that all humans have today, or almost all humans. Neanderthals didn't have. That has to do with dendritic outgrowth and axonal outgrowth. That will be a very good place to start, and I think we and others are sort of starting that.
Can I just ask, so do you think that that's where consciousness comes in? Do you think Neanderthals had consciousness?
Well, again, I guess I'm so naive. I have sort of a hard time to define consciousness for myself. I think that I would tend to say Neanderthals shared it. They lived in groups, they clearly communicated with each other. They clearly must have had...
Not with language.
They must have had oral communication. If they had language that we would immediately sort of learn or recognize as just another language is another question, I think. So I would tend to say they shared. They were humans in the sense of sharing consciousness, if I would guess, for sure.
So Bob, what do you say about why so fast?
Well, to me, the big puzzle for human evolution is how frighteningly rapid human cognitive functions developed. When we talk about evolution, we generally talk about things happening over millions of years. But over a period of, let's say, 100,000 years, all of a sudden there was this quantum jump in the functioning of the human brain, frighteningly rapidly. And there must have been small groups of people living in East Africa, I imagine, who through some genetic accident or another happened to have acquired the constellation, the combination of genetic changes that all of a sudden created an extraordinarily highly functional brain from one that was only moderately functional. But how exactly that happened, maybe Svante will one day figure out, but it still represents one of the frightening aspects, for me at least, of human evolution, how rapidly we arose and spread over the face of the earth.
And why is it frightening, if I may ask?
Because so many things happened with such rapidity. Generally, when you talk about evolution, you're talking about things happening over 1 or 5 or 10 million years. And here we're talking about something that happened almost in the blink of an eye. All of a sudden, this whole cognitive apparatus in our brains congealed from something which was far less functional. And how that happened, I guess we may well learn in our lifetimes, but we probably won't.
I mean, I think many people will contribute to finding this out, hopefully using things such as the Neanderthal genome, but in a way I don't find this frightening. I find it one of the most beautiful things. I'm unashamedly anthropocentric, I think. I think human culture and technology is a wonderful thing that have come with us and that we should be proud of, and we should use and develop it to sort of preserve the planet.
Okay, I'll be proud from now on.
I have the opposite conclusion, which is that if it happened that fast, it must be extremely simple. And so it can't be that much to be proud of. Right? What happened before that, which is what we share with the rest of the animal kingdom and even what goes back to bacteria, that's what we should be proud of.
There's something.
It is beautiful.
It is beautiful, I agree with that. But simple means that you're going to solve it.
There's something frightening about what Gary said, because if one takes off from what he said, it would suggest that there's a very small number of genetic changes that flip the switch from reasonably good cognitive function to extremely powerful function, and that we may one day discover them. A small number of changes one can actually track down. And then we're in the frightening situation of asking, among contemporary human beings, among those genes that one discovered participated in this quantum leap, are we all equally endowed with them? Do we have different variants? And I find that very unsettling.
Well, I'm not so unsettled. I think what we are then looking for is something that all humans have in common, the ability to acquire sophisticated language, for example, and to communicate. Those are the things that we really want to find out, not subtle differences between, which would be much more complex, I think, and harder to find out.
Well, that's very positive and optimistic, but there will undoubtedly be graduate students who find subtle variations in these genes that you're excited about, that we don't all have, we don't share equally. And what happens if we begin to create an atlas of genes and genetic variants that are strong determinants of human cognition? And what happens 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, where we can take placental DNA or the DNA of a newborn, and already on the basis of genetic variation and allelic variation, begin to figure out how well his or her brain will work? I find that very unsettling.
But I tell you why I'm not so worried. I mean, there has been hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into association studies and looking for positive selection in the human genome. What has one come up with as positively selected? Things that has to do with skin color, hair structure, immune defense, in how we digest food we eat. We have not come out with things that has to do with synaptic connections in the brain or such things. And positive selection is in a way the measure for what is biologically relevant. And that is not something that has been differentially selected among present-day humans. So I can in a way say all these studies of positive selection have come up with things that are incredibly boring. I knew skin color varies among humans. I know that hair structure varies among humans. I didn't need these studies to find out these things. But I'm very relieved to see that there were not other things that came up. There were not the biggest signals, were not in genes involving the neurosystem, for example.
Not yet.
We know the biggest signals.
Jennifer, let's just spend a couple of minutes on the future. So you've made an amazing, contributed and made an amazing discovery of the technology that can edit genes. And so what do you think about the future evolution? Do you think it will continue to be organic, or you think it will be sort of a combination of synthetic evolution and organic evolution?
Well, I think to echo what we're hearing in this conversation, I think one of the challenges going forward is we don't really understand our own genome, and we don't know enough about the genetic basis for most of the things that make us who we are to do any useful editing of those genes. Now that could change in the future. It probably will, from work that all of you are doing. One of the things I actually wanted to ask, I guess, Svante, is to what extent do you think it's possible that the genome itself is not going to inform about, say, human intelligence, but human intelligence is a result of what we would call epigenetics, changes that are occurring in, small RNAs or small molecules or chemical modifications to the DNA that are harder to track?
I mean, I may be too naive about this, but I would imagine that epigenetics is then another way of saying gene regulation, what genes are turned on when and where, and that may also be non-coding genes, but that will eventually also be, to a big extent at least, encoded somewhere in the genome. It will just be hard to find, but eventually we will understand it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists for a very interesting discussion, and we thank you. And I want to invite the next panelists, Nima Arkani-Hamed, Ed Boyden, Andrei Linde, Saul, Perlmutter, and Richard Taylor. And so as if we did not discuss big enough problems, we're now going to turn to why is the universe comprehensible? So, Nima, what can you say on that?
Damned if I know. Of course, fortunately, the universe is comprehensible. We've been comprehending it for over 2,000 years. I guess what boggles us as theoretical physicists is the fact that the understanding that people have come up with, especially over the last 400 years, starting with Kepler and Galileo and Newton, is that the understanding of the fundamental laws of nature is also fundamentally mathematical. And as time goes on, it involves mathematics that's simpler and deeper and more universal. So, given that fact, you can ask a more specific version of the question: why are the laws mathematical? Why are the fundamental laws mathematical? And over the years, many relatively trivial or tautological things have been said about this subject. But characteristically, Richard Feynman said some in a very pithy way in just a few pages of his wonderful book, The Character of Physical Law, that I recommend you all read. He had something to say about the subject by wondering what it would have looked like if the laws weren't fundamentally mathematical. So you might imagine that really what's going on at microscopic scales is some extremely simple rules, like some gigantic game of checkers or something like that. The actual laws don't involve any deep mathematics, differential equations, fancy things like that, just some sort of simple rules for how things move around, which when you go to somehow very large scales and see only aggregate behavior, end up having a description that looks effectively is governed by more fancy mathematics. He actually described this in the context of the sort of paradigmatic example of what mathematical laws are. The first set of mathematical laws we really understood, which were Newton's laws of gravity. So we all learn in high school that two masses attract each other by the inverse, by force, which varies as the inverse square of the distance between them. And that's a fundamentally mathematical law. But some people after Newton came up with a checkers-like version of an underlying set of rules that weren't so mathematical at all. They imagined that the universe was filled with little particles that were moving around and banging into bodies all over the place. And then if you had two bodies, one here and one there, then if you had a big guy here, it sort of cast a shadow. It prevented the particles from hitting this guy on this side from this direction. And that meant there was more of a force on it from the things banging on it from the other direction. And if you work it all out, it was an inverse square law. Okay? So that seemed to be an example of a non-mathematical underlying set of laws that was approximated by mathematical ones. But that theory ends up being wrong. It makes lots of incorrect predictions. And this has been attempted over and over again in the intervening time. Every time we have a set of laws, people have sometimes tried to find simpler non-mathematical laws underneath it, and it keeps not working. Instead, we find increasingly sophisticated and interesting sets of mathematical laws. And what's even more surprising and gives us gainful employment as a theoretical physicist is that these laws are simple. They have their own internal purpose. On the one hand, coming from trying to describe nature, but quite amazingly, our friends, the mathematicians, from their own explorations, not of the universe, but of the Platonic world of ideas, run into very similar structures. And that's absolutely amazing and completely ununderstood, I think.
Well, it's already simple enough so that I understand there are roughly 10 parameters that define everything. And the question is, why not 1,000 or 10,000?
Yeah, that's a good example of a question that we don't know the answer to. I mean, but notice that the number is like 23 or something like that. It could have been 2, it could have been 20,000. It's a funny intermediate number. The fact that it's a funny intermediate number probably means that this particular question is not as close to the really deep fundamental questions as we might like them to be. They might be still a few layers removed from when the questions are well posed enough to have simple answers. Part of the chauvinism of at least a certain part of fundamental physics is the belief that the only questions we really care about are the ones that have fundamentally simple answers. and if the answers are very complicated, well, that's probably not a clue to what the deeper underlying theory is. That may be a prejudice, it may be wrong, but it's been a good guide for the past 4 centuries.
So, Richard, why mathematics is the language in a way that you discover similar structures that then are being useful for physicists?
I wish I knew. To some degree, I think, or to a large degree, mathematicians are inspired by what the physicists are doing. Although in theory one can sit by oneself and use pure logic and invent mathematics and potentially do very interesting mathematics, that's not usually what happens if our imaginations are not sufficiently good to find the really interesting mathematics. And very often it's inspired by something far more concrete, maybe doing numerical experiments with the integers, counting. Gauss did lots of experiments, found patterns of how the prime numbers were distributed. More recently, Birch and Swinnerton Dyer revolutionized number theory by computer experiments that showed patterns nobody had imagined. And then equally, physics is telling us things. Mathematicians had been interested in curves lying on more higher dimensional things, and physicists suggested there are certain patterns here that mathematicians had never imagined existing, and now many, many mathematicians are investigating this. So somehow the physical world provides inspiration that just pure logic doesn't seem to do.
Andrei, you're one of the authors of multiverse concept, and what do you have to say on the subject? But more specifically, do you think there could be a universe that cannot be explained by simple mathematical laws?
Well, what I can say about that.
You have a microphone?
What? Oh, yeah, okay. So, during the last 30 years, we have a new theory which tries to explain why the universe is so uniform, because this was the main basis of Einstein's approach to it. Everything is uniform, and probably the coupling constants and everything should be just given in the way they are. We don't have any choice. But then we learned that if we follow the logic of the new cosmological theories, then most probably our universe looks very, very similar in our immediate vicinity, but very, very different far away from us. So when Einstein asked a question, he formulated this question, that why is the universe so comprehensible? He said that the most incomprehensible thing about our universe is that it's comprehensible. So when he formulated it, and then Eugen Wigner, actually a mathematician, said a very similar thing from the point of view of mathematics, that incredible efficiency of mathematics with respect to natural sciences like physics is a gift which we do not understand and don't deserve. So physicists say we do not understand physics. Mathematicians say that we don't understand mathematics, or why anything works. And on the other hand, if you have a universe which actually is a multiverse, which is what many of us think about right now, then there are some parts of the multiverse where quantum fluctuations are so strong that you cannot remember anything, you cannot calculate anything, whatever laws given to you, you do not recall. And there are some other parts of the multiverse where you cannot live because it's totally empty there, or the universe is rapidly collapsing. And there are some other parts of the multiverse where laws are too primitive to allow complicated forms of life like we exist. And there are some other parts of the universe where we can live, but we cannot remember anything. And if we do not remember anything because whatever, quantum fluctuations erase our memory, again, mathematics and the way of predicting future would be impossible. So in that part of the universe, well, computers will be unable to survive in the competition of whatever, some primitive organisms. So it's not that laws of physics and mathematics everywhere are efficient, but we live only in the parts of the universe where laws of mathematics and physics locally are efficient enough to allow us to win the game of evolution.
Ed, how does the human brain comprehend the universe from coming from a different angle?
Yeah, so I can start by building off from what you were just pointing out, and in order for, let's turn the question on its head a little bit. When asking how the universe is comprehensible, we should talk about what comprehension means, right? And it's quite possible that a mouse or a rat that's wandering around feels perfectly at home, and it feels like it's comprehending, maybe. It's a little speculative there. But it's not asking the tough questions. And going back to what you were saying, earlier, it's quite possible that we're not asking the tough questions either. We admit defeat on many questions, and we go back and study things that we can really nail down as a civilization. And some of that's practical, right? We want to tackle problems where you can make good progress in an appreciable amount of time, and there's really not a lot of reward for banging your head against a wall incessantly for many decades, and so there's a lot of stuff that are really difficult to challenge. So in the first panel, the topic of what exactly is consciousness came up, and I don't think they quite answered it. That's one that I think is no. I think that's one that if you ask 3 neuroscientists, you probably will get 4 different answers. And we survive, of course, by breaking things down into parts that we can analyze. So, things that our mind is good at, we extract rules, right? We find patterns. That's comprehension to some extent. And some of those patterns can lead to laws of physics, trying lots of experiments and looking for what commonalities emerge. There's also prediction, right? If you need to predict the future for a little bit, if you are trying to escape a predator or hunt prey or reproduce or find food or whatever, you have to be able to forecast a little bit into the future in order to actually make any headway. And so, these are things that under evolutionary pressure, and of course many different kinds of pressure that are all coming from all different angles, of course, our minds have evolved to confront. And so there's definitely an element there of sort of an anthropic principle. A piece of the universe where we really couldn't predict the future for a little bit and detect patterns, we wouldn't survive very long. And intelligence takes some time to achieve, at least 100,000 years, I guess, from the previous panel. So we have to be able to kind of play the game for a while in order to get to the point where comprehension is possible. I mean, the very interesting question is, as we start to understand more about the mind, and of course there's a lot of interest in artificial intelligence right now as well, could you engineer algorithms or systems that could understand more of the universe? What if we are the mouse or the rat on the ground, answering the problems that we are comfortable with, but shying away from the really tough issues? What if we can build some algorithms or systems that can understand more? And what would that be like? What would it be like to cooperate with them? Could we actually augment our own understanding, or would we have another system which could crunch the numbers, but we would never feel the visceral feeling of, yes, I got it. I actually intuitively grasped that. And I think there's a lot of that too that's important in physics.
I think that's already happening in mathematics. Things like the Kepler conjecture, which was in some sense solved by Tom Hales. It says that if you've got a lot of balls all the same size, how can you pack them most densely in space? And the supermarkets know the answer. If you look at the oranges, they're arranged in a certain pattern. But Kepler asked, is this really the densest way of packing balls in usual space? And no human comprehends the answer, but
a massive computation, really, of lots of many possibilities by a computer has shown that indeed it is. That's something that seems to me quite possible. No human will really ever understand. It may just be beyond our abilities of our brain to compute, but it's a beautiful fact, and the only explanation is too complicated for us. There are other examples that the four-color theorem that says if you have any map, you can cover all the countries in just four colors so that no two countries that share a boundary are the same color. Maybe that has a nice explanation, but at the moment the only reason we know it is that computers have plowed through millions and millions of possibilities and no human understands it. And could it be that physics is the same, that the fundamental laws you're searching for are actually beyond us?
Nima, could it be the same?
I doubt it. Well, I mean, I think first that there are a few things that were said. There's one idea that which you're alluding. It's not exactly what you're saying, but it comes up in this kind of discussion that the fact that the world seems comprehensible is part of the evolutionary advantage we have to sort of surviving and making sense of a complicated world. And that might be true. It might be true to the extent that we're describing the laws that have something to do with the everyday world that we see around us. It does not at all explain why, when we go to realms ridiculously removed from everyday human experience, we find mathematical laws governing the atom, quantum mechanics, relativity, curved space-time, black holes. The fact that the laws that show up there subsume the laws that we discovered because of our evolutionary advantage and tell us more about them and deeper things about them doesn't seem to sort of fit with this idea that the laws are some sort of meta-adaptation to understanding an otherwise fairly complicated world. But there's one more thing, though, and I don't have an answer, but I think it's an aspect of this whole discussion of why there are sort of simple mathematical laws that I find even more amazing than just the zeroth order fact that the laws exist at all, which is that even granted that there are laws that seem mathematical for some reason, obviously at any given time our understanding of what those laws are provisional. We don't understand everything. We only understand some finite number of things. So you might think that what it looks like as time goes on is that we have something that isn't quite perfect, and then we find some way that it gets better, and then some way it gets a little better still, and a little better still. And that it's a gradual process as one set of theories morphs into the next one and morphs into the next one. And it somehow isn't like that in physics. It's really very, very strange that the understanding, even the provisional understanding we have at any given moment in time, has a certain perfection to it, a certain logical completeness to it, all by itself. Newton's laws, the clockwork universe, was something completely perfect, done, a closed logical structure, and yet ended up being wrong. It's subsumed by quantum mechanics, but it's not subsumed by quantum mechanics in a sort of trivial way that you take Newton's laws and you just mess around with them a little bit and then you turn them into the more correct description. Somehow, whatever this underlying structure is, has this absolutely bizarre feature that at every level, and not just in physics as we go out, of course, into the other sciences, it keeps being true, at least to some extent, but it's certainly true in physics, that at every level there's a certain almost finality to every structure that we see, which nonetheless can be rotated in some way and understood from some different angle that allows us to see, it can be generalized, it can be hooked up to some deeper description. Why that is totally mystifying. Why it is that there are so many different ways of talking about the laws that we have right now, only some of which are better suited to going up to the next level of reality. I think the fact that it has such a sort of deep ability to generate sort of perfect things at all levels is telling us there's something to this way beyond what's an invention of our own minds.
So,
what I'm wondering about is whether, to what extent this could be a selection effect, right? That I know what you mean. It feels like we've been onto something in this very deep way. But is it possible that we're looking at the corner of reality where these things are likely to work, and we tend to not notice the other parts of reality that where this particular mapping doesn't work so cleanly, and particularly that we tend to find the ones where our brains home in on the ones where it's a fairly simple structure, as opposed to the ones where, our brains would have to hold, 227 concepts all at the same time for it to be obvious. Oh, I see why it works. It's very simple, but you can't do it unless you can hold 227 concepts in your mind all at the same time. And it's possible that when we ask the basic question, why is the universe comprehensible? It's not that the universe is either comprehensible or not comprehensible. It's that there's many different degrees of complication that you need to be able to hold, and we are very highly attuned to the ones where it's a low number that you need to hold in your mind at one time, and they seem very elegant. And this is the classic problem of the experimentalist, that you always you're making measurements, and then the theorists always turn out to tell you that, oh yes, we did predict that.
What you see in mathematics is that there's some extraordinarily beautiful mathematics which can be grasped if you're clever enough with just one ingenious idea, so that there's something miraculous going on. But there may well be other things that don't fall into that pattern. And so there may be both.
Exactly.
And where's the boundary in physics, I guess, was my question.
I guess at about the point where it gets to a slightly larger number, we start calling it chemistry, and then when it gets a little bigger number, we call it biology. It's right.
I think I have to say that the fact you say about mathematics is one of the things that really surprises many physicists about mathematics. The historical development of our subject has been continually simpler, deeper ideas that, if you understand them very well, you can explain to a bright undergraduate. And that's pretty amazing. It's been going on for four centuries. It's possible, I suppose it's possible. What you're all saying, I suppose it's possible that this is somehow this is a selection effect. Exactly. I really doubt it. It's also the sort of feeling, but I think the sort of feeling which is very common to people in all parts of theoretical science. Is that of course, it's more obvious in natural sciences where there is an actual world out there, but you're definitely not inventing something. You're discovering things that are there already. And this question about, do you have to hold 227 things in your head? It's something that I wish more people, even young people who are interested in getting into to physics or theoretical physics, knew. It's amazing how little your own natural talent has to do with success in this subject. What matters much more is to be in the neighborhood of the right answer to some set of questions. And it's an amazing experience to sort of feel that you're being led by the nose by something which is out there and gradually revealing itself to you. It's not your innate talent. It's not your personal genius. It's this amazing thing which is out there, which is explaining those 227 things that you have to keep in your head. If you didn't know about it, you would have to keep 20,000 things in your head. But somehow the fact that it's out there, it tells you what to do next. And it's something I think almost all scientists have experienced at some level. It's a magical thing. I can't imagine that it's an accident.
Andrei, you have been suspiciously smiling. What does that mean?
Wanted maybe to ask some unprepared question to Yuri, or maybe to all of us simultaneously, including the previous group of people, because our questions kind of conditioned by our culture and the present time. But here is a breakthrough prize symposium 2015. Okay, so just imagine 1,000 years later. It's Silicon Valley after all. So 1,000 years later, breakthrough prize 3015, and all audience is filled with silicon-based robots. And here is the panel of the most educated silicon-based robots, and they are trying to debate the question. You see, it's interesting whether the silicon-based life could emerge from the universe directly, or the carbon-based life was an unnecessary step.
No, I will use my right not to answer questions, but ask questions. So Ed.
Nima probably can answer.
Whether we're necessary, I really doubt we're necessary for anything.
But on that subject, Ed, are there any structural limitations that we know about human brain today that would put the limit there rather than outside of human brain?
Sure. Yeah, well, we've been talking about 227 things that you can hold in your mind at once. It's actually a lot less than that. So there's many classical psychology studies where people have tried to figure out how many different things you can hold in mind at the same time. This is called working memory. And it's actually quite small. It's under 10 things, actually. And this is anecdotally one of the reasons why I've been told telephone numbers are around 10 things or so. So one question then is whether there are many concepts in mathematics or physics where you do have to hold a certain number of things in mind all at the same time that is vastly larger than 10. Or whether, if you look at the structure of mathematical proofs or physical laws and how they're framed, do we break them down into chunks so that you never have to really think about more than a certain number of things at a time? In which case, that's very striking that you can't even do this.
But if you break them down into chunks, you might need an awful lot of chunks and you'd run out of time.
Oh yeah. Well, there are a lot of chunks. I mean, math and physics, there's a lot of different concepts and approaches, and modern proofs can seem to have sometimes hundreds of steps, right? Seems, probably I know at least about this if anybody on the stage. But if you really think about kind of how the kind of concepts that you can hold in mind are, you kind of have to abstract away some of the underlying complexity and shove it under the rug, at least momentarily. Maybe you go back and check it later, in order to deal with, and maybe even just feel that one is comprehending, that sort of level of understanding that you need in order to actually make it, something that we all agree is something that we comprehend. So.
But if we do have biological limits to comprehension, then on the other hand, the question is, do we have any sort of physical limits driven by the physical laws that dictate us themselves that not everything can be understood? So Saul, you have gotten all conceivable prizes, including Nobel Prize, Breakthrough Prize, for your discovery of the fact that the universe is not only expanding, but it's accelerating. So does it put, or any other phenomena, does it put any limitations on what we can know?
Well, I should refer back to my cosmology theorists, because there was a recent discussion about the limits of what you can contain with a certain physical amount of material. So let me turn back to you guys again.
Nima, you wanna?
Andrei should take it
away.
Okay,
Andrei, yeah.
Okay, well, then it goes back perhaps to the talk given by Raphael Busa like an hour ago. And this is something related to the question which, sometimes a statement which sometimes told to us. If you will be too smart, you will age fast. So if you will have too much knowledge, then you will collapse into a black hole. There is a limit of knowledge, of entropy, of whatever, which one person can contain, being of a given mass, of a given size. So really you should be very, very fat and thin. Then you can contain a little bit more, but this is the physical limit of how much you can have.
And Nima, does it have anything to do with accelerating universe?
Well, I mean, so that there's what Andrei was referring to ultimately puts a limit on actually even without what he's referring to, any finite creature, any finite organism, you, me, anything, there is a limit to the accuracy with which we can know anything. It's a ridiculous limit. It's I'm made of 10 to the 30 things, so with an inaccuracy of order 10 to the power of negative 10 to the 30. There's a chance that you're all a hallucination in my brain, and nothing really exists, and so everything is fundamentally has a fundamental approximateness to it if you're finite. We can always console ourselves with the thought that if you caret that ridiculously with these ridiculously tiny numbers, you can always console yourself that, well, you could always make yourself bigger. You could get larger and larger, and you could download your memory into a bigger and bigger computer, and at some point you can achieve, in principle, perfect knowledge. But the fact that we live in an accelerating universe makes everything really fundamentally proximate. We don't have access to an infinite amount of stuff. The universe, from some point of view, might be infinitely large, but what we see is what we get now in cosmology, because the regions that are far enough away, light from them will never make it to us. So there's a fundamental finiteness which is foisted on us by the fact that the universe is accelerating, and so there's a fundamental imprecision that it's ridiculous that it's even more ridiculous than 10 10 to the minus 10 to the 30, which is my imprecision. It's an imprecision of order 10 to the minus 10 to the 120. But at that sort of level, everything is imprecise. And so, but it is interesting that this fact about cosmology makes everything, including, you know, maybe every mathematician everywhere in this universe might have made the same mistake, verifying some theorem with that kind of probability. Okay, and so even so even mathematical truths might be approximate in that sense. But actually, from this ridiculous discussion, I want to come back to just to say something a little bit more practical about the biological limitations, because there most certainly is a biological limitation to our understanding of the universe. We're all mortal, and very strikingly so, so any given person, even the sort of greatest geniuses of all time, Newton, Einstein, Dirac, they didn't understand nearly as much as they wanted to. So there is a very practical biological limitation, not even the workings of the brain, just the amount of time we have to figure things out. But science is a human activity. It's a collective activity. And what really matters isn't the capability of an individual to comprehend things, but the entire process, the whole community to comprehend it. And there, all I'll say is that it's not additive, it's really multiplicative. When the large number of people, you know, everyone has their own history going through this set of ideas, and having a large number of people doing it enlarges the space of possibilities that you can explore multiplicatively, not additively. At least it's closer to multiplicative than additive. So that collective aspect of it adds a huge amount of power to something that's otherwise not only limited by these fancy things about our neural connections or whatever, but in a much more pragmatic sense by our mortality.
Well, I'm assuming this was more an optimistic statement, right?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. It's an incredibly optimistic statement. Yes.
All right.
I mean,
so on that note, then I think we should finish the panel and invite the next panelist. But thank you very much. So the next panel is called, and the last one, how does the human brain work? And I would like to invite Alim-Louis, Benabid, Karl Deisseroth, and John Hardy to try to figure this one out. Well, I kind of established this simple pattern to have the first question similar to the title. So how does the human brain work? So let's start with you.
Well, you know, this is obviously a question that we're not close to answering. I like to break it down into big categories of thing. The human brain, it stores information, and so there's something about coding, and there's something about storage. How is information represented? How is it processed? How does the brain compute with it? And this is one branch of work where much progress has been made. I also like to think about the brain as a dynamical system, like balls on a billiard table, but much more complicated. The flow of activity, the dynamic balance, do two brain regions compete for the attention of a third? How does the whole thing work without blowing up into epilepsy or shutting down in a frozen state where rivers of activity dry up like they're flowing into a desert? These are fascinating questions, big categories, they overlap somewhat. Both of these are active areas of research, and that is, of course, something that is, these are sort of the questions of our time. 200 years ago, there was a different set of questions. In the early 1800s, how does the brain work? People were asking, is it an aggregate field of some kind where all parts sort of work together to do all things, or is there more of a connectionism, a cellular connectionism, where one group does one thing, another part does another thing? And there was the very first real neuroscience experiments, I think, were done by a gentleman named Pierre Florin, who removed parts of the brains of rabbits and other animals and found that one part of the brain did movement, another part did respiration. And you know, that was the question of that time. Is it everything at once, or are there parts that do things? I think the questions of our time, you know, we're starting to understand a little bit about coding, and we're understanding a little bit about dynamics. But I think a full, deep understanding is not something we'll see in our time.
John?
I'm actually in the last session we learned that humans can't comprehend how oranges stack in supermarkets. So, at one level, maybe we to start with a kind of pessimistic thing. I think that perhaps we can never understand it. But I think the other to be more optimistic, and then I'll go back to pessimism at the end. This is a kind of multi-dimension problem. We can think of this in terms of the genes. Well, we're getting to the genes now. We kind of are getting a catalogue of genes. And then we can think about the cells, individual cells. And we're by no means close to understanding cells yet, but one can imagine, especially with the techniques that are coming now with RNA sequencing and whole proteome type things, and really understanding the structure of cells, that we'll understand neurons and glia better and better. And then really to do with the work that Karl and his colleagues have done in understanding circuits. We're getting better and better at understanding circuits, and we can understand circuits. And we've heard this morning about how we can comprehend circuits more and more, and there are more and more technologies to understand circuits. And then in behavior experiments, going up another level, we're beginning to have many ways of attacking behavior to do with imaging as well as natively just watching behavior, where we can understand things more and more. So I think we're in a great time where this problem can be attacked at many levels simultaneously, and we're also at a time when between the levels we're beginning to appreciate each other's work. It's very easy for a geneticist such as myself just to look at DNA sequences, but it's great to start to think about how this affects cells, and also looking at the work that Karl has done, and others, of course, are looking at circuits. So we're beginning to appreciate circuits and higher level things more and more. So that's the optimistic level. But then I'm going to come back to the pessimism again, I think, because yes, I don't think that we can possibly comprehend the brain. I think it is going to be way beyond us. But of course, I do suspect that we will be able to have machines, as we heard in the last panel, which will understand us, even if we don't understand ourselves, and what the precise balance of power will be between us and those machines which understand us, and when we don't understand ourselves and them, well, that's something we have to face. And actually, I know that that's something Stephen Hawking has been tweeting about recently, so it obviously concerns him as well. So I'm both pessimistic and optimistic about it.
Well, you have obviously discovered a mutation which is causing the early onset of Alzheimer's. So hopefully this will help to extend our life a little bit. So this particular, the expertise that you have in Alzheimer's, does it shed any light on how the brain works?
I could give a one-word answer to that, and that's really no. I mean, really no. I mean, we need to understand how, Alzheimer's is caused really by cells being killed. The circuits involved in memory are the first to go, but they're being killed. But really, that's not really an understanding of the brain. We need, of course, for Alzheimer's disease to understand the mechanism of that killing. But I don't think it gives. Actually, one thing I will say, slightly to temper my answer, is, we don't really know the function of the amyloid protein, the amyloid precursor protein, and my suspicion is that will be in some way, well, we know it's connected to synaptic plasticity, so I suspect that giving a no answer is just a little flippant, but I can't quite see yet how it's going to really help us.
Alim, you have obviously discovered innovative technology called deep brain stimulation, which is helping a lot of patients with Parkinson's disease. Does that technology or knowledge about why it works, does it help to understand the brain?
Well, thank you, Yuri. Actually, I would like to be more optimistic, and But unfortunately, I can't give you any answer tonight because my editor still has embargoed my paper. That's a bad joke. Well,
I thought it was good. I thought that was good.
Thank you. I do believe that, of course, we don't know how it works, but I'm less pessimistic about the future, and we will probably know much more than we know at the moment. When I was younger, one of my tutors used to teach that according to, I'm not a mathematician, so maybe I'm going to say something wrong, according to Gödel's theorem, a system cannot reach the comprehensive level which is of its order. And because of that, the brain could not reach its own level, which I think is wrong, at least in terms of considering the brain as an isolated system, and you evoked that in the previous panel. It has connection, it has access to banks of data, and the systems, the techniques are so fastly evolving now that we are going probably to know more and more, particularly in terms of structures and imaging and the new methods, and according also to Karl's work, give us day after day a huge amount of information. I believe that the structure is not the problem, of course, and it is elsewhere. It is in terms of, and even in terms of connection, this we will know. But what will be difficult to understand, and this is where the Human Brain Project currently is a little bit breaking its nose, is what is the software? How does it work? What is what are the mathematics which are underlying this function? And obviously, it looks like being a system which is highly multi-parallel in multi-dimension processing, multi-parallelly. This is a system also which has the possibility to evolve. There is neuroplasticity, so it's not stuck in a given original structure. It's also able to do self-learning to the point when we will start to lose it, as you showed that it could happen. But we will probably know much more. One thing is interesting is that through the observation of pathology, but also through the observation of the current normal capacities of the brain, we may have an insight on its structure and particularly its limits. And I want to mention essentially the sensory illusions. And sensory illusions show us that the system has not been wired, if this is a proper term, to tackle questions like, the classical cross fingers, which feels two pencils, because we are not supposed to feel the same thing on the two opposite part of the. So this gives us some incentive, some informations. Is that pessimistic? I don't think so. It's just reality, and maybe it teaches us also that we have been built under a certain principle of economy, useless to develop a system which will be totally useless. And that's what I feel at the moment.
John, what is the main thing that we have learned about how brain works in the last, let's say, 25 years?
Oh, I would say plasticity. I mean, I think that, I would definitely defer to Karl on this because this is far more his field than mine. But I would say plasticity is the thing that we have really, I think that we had much more of an idea that everything was hardwired 25 years ago, and I think that plasticity is far more. Well, I think that's a very exciting area. But Karl, what do you think? That would get my vote. I would just say one final optimistic thing. I think, listening to Corey Bergman's talk this morning, I think that we might understand the brain of a C. elegans in our lifetime. But I'll pass that over to Karl.
I mean, taking your word plasticity and expanding it more broadly, how many different kinds of things can a very simple nervous system or neural system do? I agree, that's been one of the most striking things that we've learned recently, and there are yet simpler systems than C. elegans. Corey Bargman's beautiful work has shown us the incredible complexity, the fact that we know its wiring diagram, that there's only 302 neurons, and yet we cannot fully predict or understand behaviors that come from that system. There are even simpler systems, wonderful work from Eve Marder and her colleagues at Brandeis, working with the crab's stomatogastric ganglion, even far fewer, an order of magnitude fewer cells, and yet the complexity and the dynamics, despite her brilliant work over decades, we do not fully understand that system. That I think highlights for us the challenges we face. And that is something we've learned, that the wiring doesn't explain everything, and there are complexities that we have to master. And yet, coming back to optimism and thinking about the things that matter to us, I think what Alim's work and his colleagues and Malin DeLong and everybody who's worked on deep brain stimulation has showed us that we don't need to understand every last little thing to have powerful impacts on what matters to us in health and disease. The fact that by biasing dynamics in an intelligent way, that we can powerfully resolve symptoms and that we can affect the brain in at least a question of our time. I think that is, having learned that, gives us some hope also.
Well, you have pioneered the ingenious technology to control neurons with light, which is now used by hundreds of labs around the world. And that leads me to the question about the next 25 years. Through that and other technology, what do you think it's conceivable that we will be able to learn in the next 25 years?
I would like, in the next 25 years, I would like psychiatry and neurology to continue to move and maybe be closer to where cardiology is now, where we know when a heart is pumping poorly, we understand that it's because it's a failed pump, and we can, for a particular person, we can know exactly how much the pump is not working and use medications and that are tuned to affect that precise tissue level phenotype. I would like in 25 years, my hope is that at least for some psychiatric symptoms, let's say for anxiety, we can understand, okay, it is at the tissue level, it's because of this property, and for you, this patient, we may be able to provide a intelligent therapy targeted to that tissue level phenotype. That's on the clinical end. The analogous mapping to the basic science realm, I would hope we would understand behavioral states, features of behavioral states. Anxiety, it has multiple parts. It has physiological changes, respiratory rate changes, heart rate changes. Anxiety has also cognitive effects. It feels bad. Anxiety affects our behavior. Anxiety medications affect all of these different domains. I would like to understand, I would hope in 25 years we would understand the neural circuit foundations of all of these normal adaptive processes as well, and understand how the brain chooses behavioral states, assembles them and disassembles them, and helps guide our behavior. I think that is plausible.
John, what would you like to see in the next 25 years?
No, I totally agree. I think that we won't understand the brain. I think that it is going to be beyond our understanding. But as Dr. Benabid's work shows, we don't need to understand it perfectly to make really significant inroads. In fact, I was at a meeting with Dr. Benabid. I was talking to him about this last February at the Salk Institute, and it was on the mechanisms of neurodegeneration. And there were 30 mechanistic guys and Dr. Benabid, and we were all deep into molecular mechanisms of disease and talking about this. Of course, understanding any of these mechanisms has not done any single patient any good yet. And then Dr. Benabid gave his talk, which was absolutely staggering. And he said, well, we did this, we don't know why it worked, but this is the patient before, and this is the patient afterwards. And that just, I have to say, it just blew us away to see that stuff. It was really amazing. I hope that we mechanistic guys will get a lot better. And as Karl has just said, I really hope, actually I expect that within 5 to 10 years, that we'll start to make real inroads into all of these diseases. We won't understand them completely. I think we don't need to understand them completely, but we will understand them and have interventions that are good enough to start making a real difference to these poor people with these terrible diseases.
Alim, what do you want to see in the next 25 years?
I agree that the brain, who cares about how it functions, it does very well what he's here to do. Which doesn't mean that we don't have to look in the mechanism anymore. But what I would like to see in the future is coming from the observation, and particularly from the clinical observation that we have more and more. As I suggested this morning, I was a student during the last few years that the stimulation would work for a large series of diseases in different, and a large series also of nuclei with the same parameters, 130 hertz, so something simple, something stupid, and it works. And then it has to have a reason, and the reason is probably at the level of the organization of the brain. And I suggested this morning that I could see the functioning of the brain as something which apparently looked like random activity. But when it goes to wrong behavior, wrong functioning, it has only one way to go wrong, which is to shift to a regular, periodic, repetitive system and parameters which are the same. And there is a higher frequency, there is a bursting component, which seems to be the signature of the wrongdoing of the brain. And this leads us to the fact that we might solve the problem of the brain, but we won't solve it alone. And notably, we would need more connection with the mathematicians to handle this complex structural and functional structural component of the brain, and we need new mathematics. That's the time where we had a pulse coming from one neuron going to the other one and being repeated along a circuit is gone. It's much more complex than that, and far beyond this is far beyond our current understanding, and we need the help of people who, as we heard today, are trying to find the best way to put the cans in the supermarkets.
Karl, what do we know about the mechanisms of memory?
Well, memory, most neuroscientists think that memory can be stored as gain changes at synapses, the connections between neurons. We know these are highly plastic, that bursts of activity can change the gain, give you more bang for your buck. An impulse coming from a presynaptic cell upstream goes across the small synaptic cleft and then is able to excite the postsynaptic cell, and the extent to which it excites the postsynaptic cell is tunable in part by the history of those cells, what they've done together in the past. And this this plasticity, we know from computational studies that this suffices to store memories in artificial neural networks. We even can find that this does happen, this plasticity does happen in real memory storage networks. It's affected by disease states that we know impair memory. And so this, although I would say there's not yet been a formal proof that this is how memory is stored in the brain, I would say we do not know formally what information is in the brain. I think this is a widely held hypothesis that is so far largely holding up. But information may exist in other forms in the brain as well, and I think the real proof would be to somehow collect meaningful information out from a brain that one could not have known otherwise from some components or elements of the system, and that I think remains to be done.
Do you think we can make some progress in sort of foreseeable future?
I do think the progress is coming on that front. I think the technologies that are being developed, both with structural studies of the brain and ability to precisely intervene and cause changes, and the ability to observe natural activity patterns all during behaviors in animals like mice, where we can understand that they are indeed manifesting memory retrieval. I think the parts are there, and I think on the 10-year timescale, we'll get there.
John, do you want to?
You know, I read an article by Francis Crick maybe 20 years ago when he said that he'd gone from doing DNA structure to neuroscience, and maybe he'd made that jump too soon, and that maybe we weren't ready at the time he'd written that article to do neuroscience. But I think we're right at the time now. Now is the time to do neuroscience. So I would say if there's any young students in the audience, this is the time to do neuroscience, because we have such fantastic tools now, as I said, at every level, that I'm sure we can make a big difference in our understanding and in our treatment of diseases. It's a great time to do neuroscience.
And just trying to link this panel a little bit with the previous panels, is there any limit that we know of on the computational capacity of the brain that is just physiologically, structurally in place?
I would make one quick comment. I think I think our learning rate is not maximized. I think we're set up to not learn every bit of information that comes to us. We evolved in a relatively information-poor environment compared to where we are now, and it was probably not adaptive to learn every association that occurred due to the statistics of that environment. Now we live in extremely information-rich environments, and I believe that we might be able to tune ourselves to achieve much higher rates of information intake. That said, with the instant fingertip availability of all information of humanity, maybe we don't need to learn anything.
So, John?
Yeah, ask Siri.
Okay.
Basically, it really does alter how you behave. It really does. You use your brain in different ways because so much information is there already, and this is what the first panel said too. We don't need to. We don't need, for example, to learn our times tables like we did. We that's given. We don't need to do that. So, that does allow us, I'm sure, to do extra things, for sure.
You don't remember one?
Test me afterwards. I'm suffering from jet lag a bit, but you can test me later.
Alim, that brings me to the probably last question for this panel, which is what is the interplay between human brain and computers from your standpoint in this? There are a number of people in Silicon Valley who are reasonably optimistic around elements of artificial intelligence that will be available in the next 25 years. So what do you think is the interplay between the human brain and the computers?
Well, I have a personal situation. As you may know, we are doing an exoskeleton which is brain-driven for tetraplegic, and we just got the authorization to do the clinical trial this year. So, by the way, we are putting some electronics and system like this, if not in the brain, at least very close on the dura of the brain, and then connected to a machine which allows, hopefully, to have tetraplegic people able to walk a little bit more. This is the beginning, and probably this also will depend on the evolution of technology, which will be faster than we could predict. The problem at that level is not technological. It is essentially societal, and particularly how the society does see that and does accept that eventually. And by experience, we are surprised to see that we heard something like this about yesterday during the show, people fearing from vaccination, etc. And I'm always stunned by the capability of how I'm part of the population, the capability we have to fear first before enjoying, and having fearful expectation rather than hopes. And we hear when we do this work with the exoskeleton, which is rather very low level of interplay between the technology and the brain, that people have expectation further than we have, but the bad ones. Like we are going to make clones, we are going to make soldiers which will be driven by whoever. They believe that we are working. I've been accused to be trying to make a monkey voting for Sarkozy. And I said, unfortunately, I can't. Because we don't know how to do it. And second, I'm not sure it will help really Sarkozy to win the election. So this is a little bit of joke, but it's daily like this. So the interplay between the systems, and particularly the intelligence system, could be extremely fruitful. The boundary between augmenting a person and fixing a person is difficult to find. Quite often it is easy. For instance, if you stimulate the brain of a patient with obsessive compulsive disorder and just turning on the stimulator, the patient comes back to his normal attitude. You can see it in two ways. One is you fixed his problem, he's not obsessive compulsive anymore. The other approach is you change his mentality. And to explain that we are not changing the mentality, but we are putting, it's like for a Parkinsonian patient. When we stop the tremor, we don't change the mentality. We put him in the normal situation where he has no tremor. So this is a difficulty which I see, which will probably impede a little bit the progress in this direction. And also it depends on the other aspect of the society, which is the wisdom of society. Depending on what you give him, then what's the use for it? And of course, we've seen a lot of movies, not the best ones, recently about the robots taking over the mankind, and this might happen. Why not? If we are bound to this use of what we can get. But just to come back very precisely to your yes, it will happen, it happens. Then what is the use we will have to it? Depends on us.
So, Karl, we are all very fortunate to live in this part of the world where there is such a high concentration of talent at Berkeley and Stanford, UCSF, and other amazing institutions, but also embedded in the Silicon Valley with the incredible amount of talent around computations and mathematics. So how do you see sort of for the next 10, 20 years this interplay between biology and computation, not as a threat, but rather as an opportunity to work together with these various teams to make this progress possible?
Well, it's a really exciting moment, and that the Silicon Valley environment is pretty special. Big problem we have is keeping our computer scientists in the lab and not having them hired away by Facebook and Google. I can't really match salaries, so we have to do our best. But also partnerships and teaming up, I think, are the way it will go. We already have. We have the data has. We're finally getting the data we want. A single lab. In my lab, we collect from a single mouse brain. We can collect terabytes of very interesting, in principle, structural data and activity data, and we can start to analyze it. But we need. And we have human brains also, where we have, in principle, petabytes of data waiting to be analyzed. And this is a problem not just, for storage, but access and shipping around and communicating and sharing the data. And there's nobody who does that better than I think some of these private, non-university-based Silicon Valley entities. And And the communication is there, the will is there, and I think that these public-private partnerships are going to be something that everybody's going to want to be involved with, and are actually right now.
Well, all our panelists today have made incredible breakthroughs and discoveries, and they obviously won the Breakthrough Prize and many other prizes. I want to thank them all again for having such an amazing conversation. I definitely have had a lot of fun doing this and learned a lot. So thank you again very much to all of you and to Berkeley for creating this platform for us, and to all of you for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.